When the powerful really want to undermine their enemy, they will study their food cultures, their food traditions in order to undermine them. And so everywhere I went after that, I was really curious about how the violence I was investigating was also changing the food culture.
Unfortunately, we live in a world that is filled with repressive governments that want to harm human beings. We've witnessed over the course of many, many months the ongoing genocide in Gaza that is being administered by a Trump-like character in Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. Death toll is something like 70,000, 20,000 plus children. And as I've read from the BBC, this headline, Gazans wasting away as mass starvation spreads, humanitarian groups warn. It's not just relegated to areas of the world that you and I have likely never been to, and it seems literally a world away in both our minds, but also geographically. It's happening right here in the United States, where food is being used as a weapon, or the lack thereof. This is from ProPublica just very recently. Trump canceled 94 million pounds of food aid. Here's what never arrived. ProPublica obtained records from the Department of Agriculture that detail the millions of pounds of food down to the number of eggs that never reached food banks because of the administration's cuts. That's why this particular interview that I'm getting ready to show you, you should stick around for. It'll make you better. It'll certainly make the world better if you put into action some of the things that we're talking about here. Just knowing about these things is something that we really are obligated to, I believe. If you are a believer in human rights, if you are passionate about making the world a better place, and I think you are because you're in my audience, this is something that you should be interested in. This is Michael Shaikh. He is an author and a human rights abuse investigator. This book is called The Last Sweet Bite: Stories and Recipes of Culinary Heritage Lost and Found. And he uncovers through investigation and writing some amazing things that, one, might leave you hopeful, shockingly enough, but also just illuminate all the work that needs to be done relative to securing food, not just as sustenance, but also as culture, as it's being robbed and destroyed by, again, despots and repressive governments all over the globe. So without further ado, here's the interview. Michael Shaikh, author of The Last Sweet Bite: Stories and Recipes of Culinary Heritage Lost and Found. Thank you for joining me. I'm glad we finally made this work.
Yeah, thanks for having me as well.
Listen, you probably get asked a similar question at the beginning of each one of these interviews that you go through when you're promoting this book. And that question probably goes something like, you are, or you have been a human rights violations investigator for Human Rights Watch. You were taken captive by the Taliban. You've narrowly avoided explosions in combat zones. And the question that follows naturally, I think, for a lot of people is, what made you want to write about food? Now, I would contend that question is not quite as appropriate anymore when we have headlines like this from the BBC talking about the systematic humanitarian crisis and genocide in Gaza, the choice that Benjamin Netanyahu has made to make it a tactical choice to starve the Palestinian people, including children. Babies are dying because of this. So your book really landed at a very opportune time to educate people about the choices that governments make, that militaries make, that leaders make to erase the culture of others. And food is really kind of a starting point for that in a lot of ways. Did you think when writing, I don't know the timeline when you started, but did you think when you were starting to write the book that it would become such a hot point as it is now?
I didn't think that it would be such a hot point when the book came out. I was hoping that there would be a little bit of a runway for people to absorb the message of the book, which is really, it looks at how violence, wars, genocide, occupations change and even disappear food traditions, recipes, hospitality traditions. but also the home cooks and human rights activists that are fighting to keep their food cultures alive in real time. And the idea behind this book was to put our food cultures, the protection of food cultures, on par with the protection of other forms of cultural heritage, like old churches and mosques and paintings, which the world spends millions of dollars every year protecting, but we don't spend anything on protecting what is arguably, aside from language, our most beloved cultural traditions, which are our food cultures. And so, yeah,
it's interesting because it really brings to mind that, it's not so recent anymore, but when Notre Dame burned down and the entire planet rallied to rebuild in its the exact image that it had. I mean, maybe $1 billion was raised. A lot of money was raised.
A lot of money. I undershot that by hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what the amount was that was raised, but I mean, it was a rallying cry globally. And you don't see that with the erasure of culture through food of the Palestinian people, certainly, and people couldn't give a shit less. They're starting to wake up to what's taking place there, but it's with the Rohingya people and in Myanmar and all over the globe. It's such an important point that I think that a lot of people miss, and the book is important for that. What have you found? What was the most surprising thing in the preparation and the research and writing this book that you ran across that you weren't expecting?
Yeah, so the genesis of this book actually starts with my family. My father survived the partition of India and Pakistan in the late 1940s, and for your audience may not know, that was one of the bloodiest times in the 20th century, when the British cleaved India and Pakistan in two, a country ostensibly for Hindus and a country ostensibly for Muslims. Millions were killed, millions were displaced. And my father was a teenager when he saw that. And growing up as a kid in Cleveland, Ohio, I would see my dad at different cocktail parties, and he was in conversations with people speaking other languages. And it looked like he had this magic power. And I really wanted it. And then, we would go back to Pakistan when I was a child, for family vacations. And I would get made fun of by my cousins in a language I didn't understand. And so I came home and I'm like, Dad, can you teach me Sindhi, our language? And he said, no, you're an American kid growing up in Ohio. You don't need it. And the brushback was painful, but it was truthful. I remember feeling that. I'm like, okay, great. The language bug never really left me. Fast forward, I'm in Japan. I was living there, doing some work. I'm studying Japanese and teaching English. And it's where I really learned how to cook. A Japanese woman by the name of Keiko took me under her wing in this beautiful little izakaya. And I spent a lot of time there over 3 years, drinking in front of the bar and washing dishes behind the bar.
No better place to have a food interest sparked than in Japan. So you were, I'm sure, in good company.
Really good. And she was great, but she got worried because I was single and living alone. So it must mean I wasn't eating well. So she taught me how to cook. And during one of our impromptu cooking classes, I had this wave of guilt wash over me. Here I am learning this woman's old family recipes in her language. And I couldn't do that on my own. So I went home, I was getting ready to go to graduate school. I sat down and I was having a conversation with my dad in the summer in Cleveland. We're drinking Johnny Walker Black Label. I remember that vividly. And I started asking him about the language issue again. And he's like, listen. And it was the first time he had really kind of talked to me about his memories growing up in Pakistan and witnessing partition and that violence. And it was really, I could tell that weight of those images were just like a mountain range on the horizon of his brain. They kind of never really left. And he told me, he's like, listen, even if I wanted to teach you Sindhi, I couldn't. It was just too painful. And so in that moment, I saw this kind of tentacle kind of reaching down to the generation, stealing language from me and part of my culture from my brother and sister and I. Fast forward again, I'm in Afghanistan, working for Human Rights Watch. A dear friend of mine invites me over for dinner. Been in the country for several years at that point already. There's an Afghan man named Tamim, a wonderful cook, but had, like many Afghans, had been a refugee many times in his life. Was a refugee in Pakistan, Iran, Europe, and the United States, and had come back to help rebuild during the American occupation of Afghanistan. And there was this meal spread out in front of me, and there was this one dish that I hadn't seen before. It was this beautiful golden chickpea stew, like brightened with this tangy garlic yogurt. It was really incredible. And I said to Tamim, like, I thought Tamim, because he's an incredible cook, that this was some sort of fusion that he had brought back, that he created in his mind from all his times abroad. He's like, no, this is, and I asked him if it was Afghan, and he said, yes, it's Afghan, but people are forgetting how to make it. And we got in this conversation about Afghanistan being at war in the first place. And he's like, listen, the war has narrowed our language of food. Just think about when people leave, they're taking all of this intellect with them. And they're at the same time, they're taking their recipes and culinary knowledge with them. And they're leaving the country. And so I started seeing in that moment how the language how violence had reached the generations to steal language from my family, was doing the same thing to Afghans, one recipe at a time. And so everywhere I went after that, I was really curious about how the violence I was investigating was also changing the food culture. Because I hear how the violence was changing Afghanistan's food culture. I was then curious when I was investigating war crimes in Sri Lanka, how was the Sri Lankan war affecting, Tamil food culture? How was the genocide in Myanmar affecting Rohingya food culture? And everyone wants to talk about food all the time. And even in like the worst moments, food becomes a moment of levity. But it also becomes these stories of heartbreak. You hear people just lamenting over the loss of family recipes or even broader cultural recipes. And they talk about it in ways that almost which like a family member has died.
Yeah.
And it's that painful. It's so personal to all of us. Just think about your grandmother, your grandfather, and a recipe that they may have given you, and how it's so special to cook on certain days. When people can't do that anymore, it tears at the fabric of their family and community identity. And it's really quite painful. And in these moments, I can tell you that I had, at more than one time, people rip my notebook out of my hand and write down recipes, or tell my translators to write down recipes, to take recipes out of the war zone so they wouldn't be forgotten, for other people to cook them. It was a way of them, in a last-ditch effort to keep a family recipe alive, or make sure that their culture in some way was living on in the way they understood it. And so that's the recipes in The Last Sweet Bite.
Let me... Because food is such a universal connection point for people, like you're talking about, that nostalgia, that deja vu that you can have that can just wash over you from the smell of something cooking. Why is it that you think that we, as a species, we don't protect food culture and what it means to the continuation of traditions? Like for instance, in Gaza right now,
right?
Why is it we're not doing more? I mean, there's so much that goes when you invoke that, that it's Islamophobe nonsense and all of that bullshit. But generally and universally, why is it you think that we don't do more to protect food culture?
I think there are a couple of reasons, like big reasons, right? And I think the reasons that you brought up are true too. But if I just to simplify it, I think one, when the powerful really want to undermine their enemy, they will study their food cultures, their food traditions, in order to undermine them. For example, I'll give you the United States government, colonial government, actually not even the colonial government, studied the food traditions of the myriad diverse indigenous nations in what is today the United States, in order to destroy them so they could destroy those people. A similar thing is happening today in Western China. The Chinese Communist Party is studying the food traditions of the Uyghur people and to erase them as a people.
You're very prescient, because this was my next thing I was going to ask. which is the systematic erasure of culture and people, often is attacks on food. Myanmar and Bangladesh, the Uyghurs in China. And I was going to bring up that this isn't a faraway story for other people.
No,
this happens right here in America with the Pueblo nations. You're just dancing on my grave before I can even get to the question, Michael.
We're on the same page. We're on the same page. But it's one of the things that really surprised me during the research of this book is you can see it in old documents. Deb Haaland, the former Secretary of the Interior under the Biden administration, who is now running for governor of New Mexico, brilliant woman. She's from I forget which Pueblo nation she's from, but she led this review of the legacy of the boarding schools in the United States, in which the United States government stole children from Indian families.
Horrific.
And tried to erase their culture by teaching them white culture. In the report that her team put together, there are some really dramatic and stark and eye-popping quotes from our founding fathers about the plans to attack the food cultures and the farming and to steal children, to teach them Western culture, farming culture, in order to undermine their food culture, to make them white, essentially.
Yeah.
And these kind of things are happening today in Western China with the Uyghurs. And so I think that really surprised me to see the extent to which governments will study communities in their countries that they want to erase and their food cultures.
And so it's not it's not just like they happened upon it. It's an explicit effort to do so, and they attack the food as a part of it.
Yeah, it is not a byproduct. It is it's a plan.
Yeah.
Right. It's thoughtful. And I think that's one reason why I think it happens. I think another reason that is often overlooked, but I think something that we inherently understand, is that women are the load-bearing pillars of our culinary cultures around the world. Forever, they have created our culinary cultures across the world, right? And in modern times, in contemporary warfare, and then, the corollary to that is it's on the side, but protecting of cultural heritage. The people who wrote those rules, the rules of war, the people who wrote how to protect culture in wartime were rich white European men mostly. Mm-hmm. And because the culinary arts, mostly what food is made in homes, is done by women, and therefore it was not seen as an elevated form of art like painting or architecture. It was done by women, so devalued. So there's at the heart of this is a bit of misogyny.
Sure.
And so I think when you have those two things together, you just create this real lacuna in our understanding and then our actions when it comes to our understanding of our importance of food culture, which we all get, right? But having that kind of codified and that kind of policy action, like we get this real lacuna here because of those two things.
I think we're at a deficit here in the United States, the white population, at least. I can't really speak to anything other than being this guy and growing up looking like this. I'm very Republican coded. You know what I mean? And there oftentimes is kind of this idea that we don't really have culture here in the United States, but do you think that oftentimes it's that idea that food doesn't really tie to culture because we think we don't really have a culture, even though we most certainly do here? Yeah, I mean, the United States has there's so many different cultures here, right, that make up one grand American culture, right? There's food from all over the world and food cultures from all over the world. And a lot of really wonderful things are happening in the United States when it comes to food, right? And I think this is kind of another issue. Like, violence can erase a food culture, but when you have refugee areas, places of safe haven, peace, like the United States has traditionally been up until this administration, right? You see an efflorescence of culture, right? You see peacetime and creativity. My point with this book
is it's not to make arguments on authenticity. Who's the owner of hummus, right? It's not that, or whose crab curry is the most authentic. No, my point is, and most cooks that you read about in this book and who you meet in this book will tell you cuisine changes. And particularly when it rubs up against another really wonderful culture.
Same with language.
With language. Yeah. They mix. They become something else. There are elements of both that either create something new or add to another or add to the other. And that's natural. But my point is that cuisines, food culture shouldn't change on the terms of an invading army. They should change on that community's own terms.
Yeah.
And so I think, there's a really interesting example of this that is in Sri Lanka, in the Sri Lankan Civil War that was fought between the Tamils and the Tamils and the Sinhalese, Tamils mostly being Hindu, the Sinhalese being mostly Buddhist in Sri Lanka. And there was this really beautiful crab curry. It was kind of the mainstay, the centerpiece, the jewel in the crown of Elam Tamil crab cooking, of Elam Tamil cuisine. And what the Sri Lankan Navy did during the war that lasted about 30 years up until from 83 till roughly 2009 is that they blockaded the northern part of the island between India and Sri Lanka, where Tamil fishermen would fish and sustenance for their families and communities, and they blockaded to prevent weapons from coming in. But over a generation, Tamil fishermen weren't unable to go out to fish. Crab curry basically people stopped cooking it. They turned inland for their protein rather than to the sea, and a lot of people started forgetting their family recipes around this. And then after the war, what happens is people can go out to fish again, but at the same time, the United States, Canada, parts of Southeast Asia, China have gotten richer, and the taste for crab has exploded in these communities. And now is pricing that crab is being exported out. And so you have this double whammy effect of kind of this memory loss, culinary memory loss. And now those chefs who are trying to recreate it are having a hard time getting the crab because they're being priced out of their own cuisine.
So it's what I'm hearing is, and you're taking a real controversial view here. Genocide bad, misogyny bad, and capitalism not the greatest is what you're saying. So all of these things are contributing to the erasure of food culture, of language culture, of the very lives of, we're coming up on 70,000 people dead in Gaza at the hands of Benjamin Netanyahu, and this just horrific, the famine that is now taking place.
Yeah, but this doesn't have to be.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot like you have it all figured out, but have you come to any ideas about solutions that we can kind of put into place to pressure governments, to pressure organizations to get on the ground, and what are some solutions here?
Sure. No, that's a really great question. Awesome question. One, we need to articulate what we all know, and that our food culture is important to us. We inherently feel that. Mm-hmm. We know that. We get defensive about our food cultures and our family recipes. We know that. So I think that's one step we all can take, is just recognize and, talk about it as being important as, special form, other art forms, other forms of heritage. And we need to be talking about that publicly, right? And not just keep it into the kitchen and restaurants and Instagram, right? We really need to talk about it. And I think how does that translate into policy, I think is what you're getting at.
Yeah.
One, when we talk about Gaza, and I think it's really important to talk about starvation here and the weaponization of food in that way. Gaza's food culture has been attacked by the Israeli government for a long time. Not just since October 7th, but well before then. And so I think we need to recognize that. And it's become in its most acute form in this war has been through starvation. And that is already considered an international crime. And so there is a legal recourse, there is a policy recourse for starvation. Where I do think we can be more proactive is that going back to the case of the Uyghurs in Western China, the Chinese Communist Party is actually forcing people to eat another cuisine, to eat other foods that are anathema to those cultures. It's force feeding people in some ways, other foods. And I think that kind of attack on culture has to be criminalized too. I think not just the withholding of food, but the forcing of a food culture onto other people. You have to have two sides of the same coin here. I think looking at when food culture is attacked, again, like what's happening in Western China, seeing an attack on culture and particularly food culture as a presaging attack on people. Same thing with the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. Attacks on their culinary heritage clearly has presaged an attack on the people. Yeah. And so I think looking at that, and then secondly, and that's it, like just kind of paying attention around these kind of things. And I think from a policy point of view, there's some places that we can work out. And I don't actually think it's a very expensive thing to do either, right? I think when you're looking at, say, when the Rohingya had genocided and forced to cross the border into Bangladesh from Myanmar, the international aid agencies can quickly start supplying them with culturally relevant food, working with them to document the aspects of the culture they think are important from the very beginning. That's being done now to an extent, but it is politicized to some extent there.
Well, you're talking about Myanmar, specifically. It's even worse because after USAID shut down, sure, Marco Rubio said, I have the quote right here. Marco Rubio said, "No one has died because of this government's decision to gut foreign aid. No children are dying on my watch." And that is absolutely a lie, especially related to the death of children because of starvation. That is happening right now. And as an American, we are complicit in this. We're allowing this to take place right now in our name with our tax dollars. And it's unconscionable. That's why the book is so important right now in this moment.
Thank you. Yeah, no, and it is. And I would just encourage the Secretary of State to call up some of the researchers at Boston University who are tracking this.
Yeah.
And looking at the potentially hundreds of thousands of deaths that are going to be caused by the gutting of USAID. I didn't
mean to hijack your answer about the solutions.
No, you didn't at all.
So really it is to pressure governments and use while we still have some democratic power to pressure. I don't know how much pressure could be brought to bear against Donald Trump and the fascist nonsense that's taking place there. But certainly if you live in Europe, and I've got a large European audience, pressure your lawmakers.
Yeah. And I mean, it's something that, thankfully, there is a scale back of humanitarian assistance that's happening in Europe, but not to the dramatic extent that's happened in the United States. Mm-hmm. But I would encourage those governments to think about the protection of food culture in times of war, right? We do a really good job of protecting culture and promoting it outside in peacetime. But I'm talking about specifically in war, we think about the protection of physical artwork, architecture. There's legal frameworks around that. We may not need legal frameworks to protect a culinary culture, maybe with the exception of forcing people to eat other foods. That should be probably criminalized in some manner. But working with refugee communities once they cross a border to think about how they eat, what they eat, helping them document if they want to archive recipes. Because honestly, a lot like the Rohingya, as much as they're probably not going home for a long time.
Yeah.
And that culture, talking to Rohingya activists, they really are very concerned about their culture disintegrating. And there's been a more concerted effort to end statelessness, but at the same time, help them document and archive their culture in the way they want. And I think that has to happen going forward with other, this is going to happen, right? What's happened to the Rohingya is going to happen to other communities. And so just paying attention to when people cross the border and they're disconnected from their land, what does that mean for their culture? And in the hope when they go home, there is a plan to help reseed it.
Yeah. Well, listen, I am a super lucky guy because doing this stupid job that I have, I get to brush up against people who are orders of magnitude smarter and more passionate than me. And you're one of these people. You know, we met briefly at a book event here in DC while you were having a talk about the book. And I was mesmerized at the level of detail and interest and passion and trying to make the world a better place, which is something I yammer on about a lot, about being genuine, about taking care of one another. And you embody that. So without getting emotional, I appreciate you. And I think that you're doing very, very important shit, writing this book and getting this message out. So I would recommend to everybody to go check this out. The Last Sweet Bite, Stories and Recipes of Culinary Heritage Lost and Found by Michael Shaikh. And thanks for being here, Michael.
Thank you for having me.